Let's talk about the biggest invasion of Russia by conventional forces since the Second World War. As of this recording, Ukraine controls over 400 square kilometers of Russian territory. A feature of Putin's imperial project is its borderlessness, not just in the sense of not having boundaries that stop you from going over to the neighbor and taking their stuff, but also in the sense of not being aware of your own boundaries. Putin doesn't sharply distinguish between Kursk region and Ukrainian territory. If his regime security depended on it, he'd happily bomb Kursk instead of Ukraine. And neither do the Russian people really. The locals feel the difference, but most of the Russian population doesn't care. It's like a pinch onto a body that has received an anesthetic injection. Doubtless, Ukraine's action has several purposes, but if one of them is to wake up the Russian population, that ain't gonna happen with an invasion of this size. You might say, why not? Surely more information for Russians about what they're doing in Ukraine and what blowback they're receiving onto Russian territory should wake them up, but the answer is no. The Russian people are not ignorant of the truth. They are resistant to it. Accepting the truth would mean accepting that their entire arrangement with politics, which they believe is unchangeable, has ended in catastrophe. Again, they don't believe they can change anything. It's a state of deep depoliticization. They're not ignorant of the truth. They are resistant to it. Putin's own indifference to the Kursk region is staggering but expected. Here he is giving citizens who got displaced $115.
Решение о единовременной выплате по 10 тысяч рублей гражданам, которые в этом нуждаются. Принято.
And these $115 illustrate better than any words can Putin's indifference to his country's borders, his cavalier attitude to control over the monopoly of organized violence on Russian territory, his disdain for his own citizens. This is the grossest kind of height of political irresponsibility. Russian propaganda in response to Ukraine's invasion has been caught between politicization and depoliticization. Politicization says, wow, this is a big deal. Depoliticization says, there is nothing to see here. Alexander Dugin, the intellectual entrepreneur who doesn't lead anything, but is a smart, preemptive follower of where the Kremlin is drifting, put it poignantly, if not comically. He said, there are no more borders between Russia and Ukraine. There is only the combat contact line. This is how we should think. Serious people don't pay any attention to borders at the time of war. Meanwhile, Mr. Apti Aludinov, the commander of the Chechen Akhmat battalion, got into trouble with Z military bloggers for letting the Ukrainian forces through. And here is his ludicrous account of what happened. They calculated everything really well. They did their work correctly. But they failed to realize that God loves Russia and is unlikely to let bad things happen to our country. But make no mistake, while an invasion of this size is ludicrously normalizable by the Russians, it still adds one more mine underneath the Putin regime. It's a small mine, but its import is big. It's a mine that impacts Russia's chances of staying together because unlike theatrical Twitter activists who often make naive arguments about Russia falling apart, Mr. Putin is himself diligently at work at increasing the chances of Russia not staying together by undermining the monopoly over organized violence on Russian territory, by calling Ukrainian territory Russian and thereby bringing war onto Russian soil, and via his brutal assaults on Ukraine, forcing Ukraine in the war of survival to conduct operations on Russian soil. And here I want to make an intervention as a moral philosopher, because I think we tend to over-moralize Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory. Asking each time Ukraine attacks Russia, was this just? Was this ethical? Risks being a moral misunderstanding of war. A denial of how far ethics and justice have to get out of the way in an existential conflict. Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory are certainly not unjust. Rather, they are neither just nor unjust. They're a product of an emergency situation in which other values have to prevail, such as Ukraine's security, national survival, and sheer necessity. Let's stay with this business of the war moving onto Russian soil. You've heard me talk about it for 2 years if you know me well, but sometimes it's worth reheating old cabbage. The worse the war is going for Ukraine, the more manpower shortage challenges Ukraine has, for instance, the more likely it'll be to move the war onto Russian soil. The less we arm Ukraine, the more likely Ukraine will be to move the war onto Russian soil. I really agree with friend of the channel Anders Bak-Nielsen when he argues that underarming Ukraine actually risks escalating the war because it might force Ukraine into more improvisatory actions on Russian territory. Sometimes, and this is a possible criticism of the Biden administration, an excess of caution can make the world a more dangerous place. And this holds for nuclear escalation too. What the Kursk invasion demonstrates is that when things get desperate for Ukraine, Kremlin nuclear blackmail no longer works on it, even though, of course, it does continue to work on the West. Whatever outcome Ukraine's invasion of the Kursk region takes, it's a message to Russia from the future. For the few Russians who are politically awake, it's an echo of a Russia to come. But let's not be naive. The fact that Putin's project has nothing to offer the world except violence and bullshit does mean that it can't sustain itself in the long term. But this does not necessarily translate into good news for Ukraine. One possible outcome that the West should really try to avoid is a situation where Russia's self-immolation drags Ukraine down with it, with neither states being viable in the future. A non-viable Ukraine as a result of Putin's invasion is as acceding to a Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance inappropriately trying to move borders in Europe. Now, to keep my speech ethically responsible, I've stayed out of speculating about Ukraine's purposes. But whatever Ukraine's purposes, they are acting against a background where talk of peace is increasingly prominent. To understand more about what sustainable peace might be, and to understand the risks of pushing Ukraine into a fraught peace that leads to more war, watch this video next.